On the northern side of the oldest pyramid in the world, there is a small sealed box of stone, leaning against the great stepped mountain, and in the front of that box there are two small round holes, cut at the height of a seated man's eyes. If you were to kneel in the cool shadow and look through those holes, you would meet, across more than 4,500 years, the gaze of a king. For inside that sealed stone box sits a statue, a life-sized figure of a seated man, wrapped in a long cloak, a striped headcloth framing his face, his eyes once inlaid with rock crystal so that they would glint in the dark. He stares out through the two small holes toward the northern sky, and he has been staring there in the dark, in the silence. For 46 centuries, that king was called Necherikhet. The world today knows him by another name, a name given to him more than 1,000 years after his death, Djoser, and the statue in the sealed box, staring forever northward through two small holes, was not made to be seen by the living. It was made for the dead. It was made so that something the Egyptians believed survived the death of the body, a kind of life force they called the K, would have a home of stone to dwell in, a body that could not decay, a pair of eyes that could watch the eternal stars wheel overhead, night after night, forever. The whole vast monument we call the Step Pyramid, the first pyramid ever built, was not, in the end, a tomb in the way we think of tombs. It was a machine for eternity. It was built to carry one man past death, and to keep carrying him without end. Tonight, we are going to follow that journey. Not the building of the pyramid, which is a story for another night, but the deeper and stranger story of what it was all for. The death of King Djoser, and everything his people did to make sure that death would not be the end of him. We are going to descend slowly into the dark beneath the steps, down a shaft sunk nearly 30 meters into the rock, through a maze of tunnels and chambers, to a vault of granite where a king was laid to rest. We are going to walk the great stone courtyard built so that the king could run his royal jubilee, his festival of renewal, not once, but forever. In the life beyond, we are going to stand before the sealed box and the watching statue, and we are going to ask what the Egyptians believed happened to a king when he died, and how this one king at the very dawn of the age of pyramids tried to build himself a doorway into eternity out of stone. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand how Djoser is believed to have died, what became of his body, what waits in the granite vault beneath the pyramid, and why his sarcophagus was found empty, what the strange sealed statue was for, and why it stares at the northern stars, what the mysterious second tomb at the southern edge of the complex might mean, and above all, what the ancient Egyptians believed about death itself, in this earliest age, before the famous afterlife of later times had fully taken shape. You will understand why a king would pour the wealth of a kingdom into a monument he would only ever use after he was dead. And you will understand why, 4,500 years on, a statue still sits in a sealed box on the north side of the first pyramid, watching the sky. This is a story about death, but the Egyptians did not see death as we so often do, as a darkness, an ending, a fall into nothing. They saw it as a passage, a journey from one kind of life into another, from the brief life of the body into a longer life among the stars. And so, this is really a story about a journey, the last and greatest journey of a king, and about the extraordinary lengths to which a whole civilization went to make sure that journey would succeed. There are few better stories to carry you gently down towards sleep, for it is at its heart a story of rest, of a king lying down in the dark beneath a mountain of stone, in the confident hope that he would rise again among the imperishable stars. Think, for a moment, about how strange and how moving this is. A man knowing he would die, as all men die, spent the wealth and the labor of an entire kingdom, not on a palace for the living, not on monuments to his victories, but on a house for his death, a vast complex of stone, larger than some entire cities of his age, built for one purpose above all others, to carry him safely through the doorway of death and into a life beyond. He would never see it finished with living eyes, or rather, he would see it only after he had died, when the part of him that survived came to dwell there. Everything in that great monument, the pyramid, the courtyards, the sealed statue, the granite vault, the hidden chambers with their walls of blue tile, was built for the dead king, by the living, as an act of faith in a journey. None of them could prove, and all of them believed. There is something almost unbearably human in that, the fear of death, and the refusal to accept it as the end, and the willingness to move mountains of stone in the hope of something more. These are among the oldest and deepest things in us. And here, at the dawn of recorded history, we find them carved into the desert on a scale the world had never seen. And the questions gather as we look closer. How did the king actually die? What was done with his body? And why was the great granite vault beneath the pyramid found empty? The king himself gone. What was the meaning of the sealed statue, staring north through its two small holes? Why was there a second tomb at the southern edge of the complex? A tomb too small to hold a body. And what did the Egyptians truly believe waited for the king on the far side of death? These are the threads we will follow. Slowly, one after another, down into the dark and out the other side, until the picture is as full as 4,500 years will allow it to be. We will move without hurry, the way the Egyptians measured time, not in the rush of minutes and hours, but in the slow turning of the river's seasons and the wheeling of the stars. There is no need to follow every name and every date. You need only let the story carry you. The way the dark waters of the night sky were thought to carry the dead king toward the stars that never set. If your eyes grow heavy, let them close. If your thoughts begin to drift, let them drift. The story will hold you and carry you all the way down into sleep. For this is, in the end, a story not of darkness but of hope, the hope of a people who looked to death in the face and refused to believe it was the end, and who built, out of stone and faith and the labor of thousands, a doorway through which their king might pass into a life beyond. We do not need to share that hope to be moved by it. We need only follow it gently into the dark beneath the steps and see how far it reached. So let us begin that descent now slowly, into the world of the first pyramid king and his long journey beyond death. Before we go on, if you find these journeys into ancient Egypt as fascinating as we do, take a moment to like the video or subscribe. It is a small thing, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. So let the modern world fall away now, the way the light fades from the desert at the end of the day. Let the centuries roll back, past the great pyramids of Giza, which had not yet been imagined, past everything, until we are standing on a desert plateau west of an ancient city, in the cool of the evening, before a stepped mountain of pale stone, where a king is preparing for the longest journey of all. We are going to follow him down into the dark and out. The Egyptians believed into the light beyond. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin. To understand the death of King Djoser, and the strange and magnificent monument built to carry him beyond it, we must first stand in his world and feel the time and the place in which he lived. So let us go there. Slowly in our minds, to Egypt some 4,700 years ago, in the early centuries of what we call the Old Kingdom. This was the dawn of Egypt's great age, but it was still very early. The two lands of Egypt, the long, narrow valley of the south and the wide green delta of the north, had been united into a single kingdom only a few centuries before, by the first kings whose names survive on stone. Djoser belonged to the third dynasty, the third great line of kings to rule that united land, and he came near the very beginning of the Old Kingdom, the age that would, in time, raise the pyramids of Giza and produce some of the most enduring monuments in all of human history. But none of that had happened yet. When Djoser came to the throne, there were no pyramids anywhere on earth. There was no tradition of building great monuments in stone. Kings were buried, as their ancestors had been, in tombs of mud brick, low flat-top structures we call mastabas, sunk over shafts that descended to the burial below. The world Djoser was born into had never seen a pyramid, had never seen a colossal building of cut stone, had never imagined such a thing. And it was Djoser, and the brilliant servant who designed his monument, who would change that forever. Let us dwell on those older tombs for a moment, the mastabas, because to understand the leap that Djoser made, you must first see what came before. The word mastaba is not ancient Egyptian at all. It is a much later Arabic word for a low bench, the kind of mud brick bench that sits outside village houses, and the early archaeologists gave the tombs that name because, from a distance, that is exactly what they looked like: long, low, flat-topped benches of mud brick rising from the desert. Beneath each one, a shaft descended into the rock to the burial chamber, where the body was laid with its goods for the life beyond. Above ground, the mastaba marked the place and housed the offerings and the rituals for the dead. For generations, this was how the great ones of Egypt were buried, kings and nobles alike. In these low, rectangular mounds of dried brick, they were impressive in their way, but they were earthbound, modest, made of the same mud that built the houses of the living. Nothing about them reached for the sky. Nothing about them was built to last forever in stone. And then came Djoser, whose monument would begin as just such a mastaba, a single low square of stone, and would not stop there, but would rise stage by stage into 6 great steps climbing toward the heavens. But that is the story of the building, and tonight we follow the king and his journey, not the architecture. For now, simply hold the contrast in your mind, a world of low mud brick benches for the dead, and then suddenly a mountain of stone. Picture the land itself. The great river, the Nile, ran the length of Egypt from south to north, the single thread of water and life cutting through an immense desert. Along its banks lay the narrow strip of dark, fertile soil, renewed each year by the flood, where the Egyptians farmed and lived. And on either side, rising sharply from the green, lay the desert, the red land, the dry land, the land of the dead. For the Egyptians buried their dead in the desert, away from the precious farmland, out in the dry sand where the heat and the aridity preserved the body. And they buried them, above all, on the western side of the river, in the direction of the setting sun. For the sun sank each evening into the west, and the Egyptians came to think of the west as the land of the dead, the place where the dead went, following the sun down into the world beyond. To die, in the Egyptian way of speaking, was to go to the west. And the dead themselves were sometimes called the Westerners, those who had gone ahead into that land beyond the horizon. And so the cemeteries of Egypt lined the western desert, looking out over the river toward the rising sun in the east, where the sun was reborn each dawn. There is a gentleness in that image when you sit with it, death not as a fall into darkness, but as a following of the sun into the west, into a land from which, like the sun, one might rise again. Djoser ruled from a great city the Egyptians had founded at the meeting point of the two lands. The city we know by its later name, Memphis, near the apex of the delta, where the southern valley opens out into the northern plain. It was the seat of the kings, the heart of the kingdom, a city of mud brick palaces and temples and workshops, of officials and priests and craftsmen, all serving the king who ruled the two lands from its midst. And across the river from that city, up on the western desert plateau, lay the burial ground of the capital, a place we call Saqqara, a long stretch of pale desert overlooking the green valley, where the great ones of Egypt were laid to rest. Saqqara was already an ancient cemetery in Djoser's time. The nobles and officials of earlier kings were buried there in their mud brick mastabas, their tombs strung along the edge of the plateau, looking out over the river and the fields below. But Djoser chose this plateau for something new, something that had never been built before. He chose it for a monument that would rise from the flat desert in 6 great steps, a mountain of pale stone climbing toward the sky, visible for miles across the valley, dominating the skyline of the capital, the first pyramid, the eternal house of the king. From the city below, from the fields, from the river, the people would have looked up and seen it rising. Year by year, this impossible thing, this stairway of stone reaching toward the heavens. Nothing like it had ever stood on the earth. Now let us turn to the man himself, as far as the evidence allows us to know him, for he is a figure who stands half in light and half in shadow. His name in his own lifetime was Netriket, a name that means something close to the most sacred of the body or divine of body. A name proclaiming the special and sacred nature the Egyptians attached to their king. For the Egyptians did not see their king as merely a powerful man. They saw him as a figure set apart, standing at the meeting point between the human world and the world of the unseen powers they revered. A sacred king, bound up with the figure they called Horus, the falcon, the protector of kingship. The king was the guardian of order, the one who held the world in its proper balance, the living link between his people and the powers that governed the cosmos. And this is why the death of a king was such a momentous thing, and why such enormous effort went into carrying him safely beyond it. The king was not just a ruler whose passing left a throne empty. He was the keystone of the ordered world, and his journey into the afterlife had to succeed. For the sake of the whole kingdom, not only for his own sake, the name Djoser, by which the world knows him today, was given to him by Egyptians who lived more than 1,000 years after his death, who looked back on him with such reverence that they added this name of honor to his memory. So even his name is doubled, layered, the everyday royal name of his own age overlaid by the name of awe, given by later generations. We will return to that doubling, for it tells us something about how powerfully this one king was remembered. What do we know of his life? Less than we would wish, for he lived at the very dawn of recorded history, and the records are thin. He is believed to have been the son of the last great king of the dynasty before him, a ruler named Kasekemwi, and of a queen named Nematap, who is remembered as a kind of mother of the royal line, honored by later kings as the ancestress of the dynasty. He had a queen of his own named Hetefernebdi, and at least one royal daughter whose name survives. He came to the throne and reigned, by the best estimates, for somewhere around 19 years, though some scholars, reading the ancient records differently, have suggested it may have been longer. Perhaps closer to twice that, if certain counts refer to events that happened only every second year. It was a reign long enough, in any case, to conceive and very nearly complete the most ambitious building project the world had yet seen, a monument that would take many years and the labor of thousands to raise. And then, like every king who has ever lived, he came to the end of his days, and the great machine of stone he had built for his eternity received him at last. But to understand what that monument was for, we must understand how the Egyptians of this earliest age thought about death, and their beliefs were already deep and strange and beautiful. The Egyptians did not believe that a person was a single simple thing. They believed that a human being was made of several parts, and that some of those parts survive the death of the body. There was the body itself, which had to be preserved, for the Egyptians believed the survival of the person was bound up with the survival of the body. And there was a part they called the K, a kind of life, force, a vital essence, a double of the living person, born with them and living on after their death. The K was not the body, and it was not quite what we might call the soul. It was something particular to Egyptian thought, a sustaining life force that needed even after death, to be fed and cared for. The K required offerings, real food and drink, brought to the tomb by the living or provided by images and spells if the living should fail. And the K required a place to dwell, a body to inhabit. The preserved body of the dead could serve as that home. But bodies decay, even in the dry sand, even when carefully prepared, and so the Egyptians provided a second home, more lasting than flesh. A statue, a stone image of the dead person, into which the Ka could enter and dwell. This is why the Egyptians placed statues in their tombs, not as decoration, not as portraits for the living to admire, but as eternal homes for the Ka bodies of stone that could never rot. Hold that idea close, for it is the key to the sealed box and the watching statue on the north side of the pyramid, and to much of what we will see tonight. And there was, above all, in this earliest age, a belief about where the dead king went, a belief tied not to the sun, as it would become more fully in later centuries, but to the stars. In the far north of the sky, there is a group of stars that never set. As the heavens wheel through the night, most stars rise in the east and climb across the sky and sink in the west, vanishing below the horizon, dying, in a sense, each night. But the stars near the northern pole of the sky behave differently. They simply circle round and round a fixed point, never sinking below the horizon, never disappearing, shining every single night of the year, season after season, age after age. The Egyptians watched these stars, as people have always watched the stars, and they saw in them something miraculous. Stars that did not die. They called them the imperishable stars, the indestructible ones, the ones that never set. And they came to believe that the dead king ascended to join them, to rise up into the northern sky and take his place among the stars that never die, and so to live forever, unchanging, beyond the reach of death and decay. This is why, as we will see, the watching statue of Djoser was set to gaze toward the north, through its two small holes fixed forever on the region of the imperishable stars. This is why the ceiling of his burial vault was planned to be carved with 5 pointed stars, so that the king would lie beneath a sky of stone. The king was not simply being buried in the ground. He was being launched, his people believed, upward, northward, toward the stars that never set, to shine among them forever. Death was not a descent into the dark. It was, they hoped, an ascent into the eternal light of the northern sky. There is one more belief we must add to this picture, for it will matter greatly when we walk the great courtyards of Djoser's complex, the belief in renewal, and the festival the Egyptians built their kingship around. The Egyptians held a great royal ceremony called the Sed Festival, or the Jubilee, a ritual of renewal that a king traditionally celebrated after he had reigned for a long span of years, often said to be 30. In this festival, the aging king demonstrated that he was still fit to rule, that his powers were undiminished, that he could still hold the two lands and uphold the order of the world. At the heart of the ceremony, the king ran a course, a ritual run across a marked field before the assembled symbols of the land, showing his vigor and his strength. And then he was, in effect, crowned again, renewed in his kingship, his reign begun afresh. It was a ceremony of rejuvenation, a turning back of time, a defeat of age and decline. And here is the crucial thing for our story tonight. The Egyptians came to believe that this renewal need not end with death. If the king could perform the Jubilee in the afterlife, again and again forever, then he could be renewed forever, his powers restored without end, his kingship eternal. And so, as we will see, Djoser's great complex was built to let him run that Jubilee not once, but for all eternity, a stone stage set for the endless renewal of a dead king. Hold that thought close, alongside the Kie and the imperishable stars, for these three beliefs together, the life force that lives on, the stars that never die, and the renewal that never ends, are the deep machinery of everything Djoser built. Now picture the place where it all would happen, the plateau of Saqqara. In the years when the great work was rising, the desert there is high and pale and dry. The limestone bedrock close beneath a skin of sand, and from its edge you look down and eastward over the green ribbon of the valley. The river glinting beyond, the city of the living spread along its banks. Up on the plateau, the older mastabas of the nobles stood in their rows weathering in the sun. And then, in Djoser's reign, the plateau became the greatest building site the world had ever known. Thousands of workers labored there, quarrymen cutting the pale limestone, haulers dragging the blocks on sledges, masons setting them in place, all under the direction of the king's brilliant servant who had conceived the design. Year after year the monument rose, first as a great square platform, then climbing in stage after stage until it stood in 6 enormous steps against the sky. And around it grew a whole stone city of courtyards and chapels and walls, enclosed by a vast rectangular wall of pale limestone, taller than several men, its surface carved to imitate the paneled esse fede of a great palace. This was not a building for the living to inhabit. It was a palace and a stage and a temple all at once, built for a dead king, so that his Ka might dwell there, and receive its offerings, and run its eternal jubilee, and rise to the imperishable stars. The labor of thousands for years poured into the eternity of one man, and offered, we must remember, not as slavery in the way we might imagine, but very likely as a kind of service and devotion, the work of a people who believed that the safe passage of their sacred king into the afterlife protected the order of the whole world, and so protected them all. And we should pause gently on the family the king left behind, for they too belong to this story of his ending. His queen, Hetepernepti, is shown on surviving stone fragments, and a royal daughter whose name comes down to us as Inet appears beside her. They were part of the world that mourned him and that carried out, or oversaw, the rites of his burial. His mother, Nimahatap, the queen of the king before him, was remembered for generations as the ancestress of the line, the mother from whom the dynasty sprang. These were the people around the king at the end: a queen, a daughter, a remembered mother, a court of officials and priests, and above them all the brilliant servant who had built the king his eternity. When Djoser died, it fell to them to carry him into the great monument, to perform the rituals that would launch him toward the stars, and to seal him into the dark beneath the steps. We do not have their words or the details of their grief, but we can imagine the solemn procession, the body of the sacred king borne up onto the plateau, into the great walled complex, toward the shaft that descended to the granite vault, the living carrying the dead king toward the eternity he had spent his reign preparing. So that is the world, a young kingdom, only a few centuries old, at the dawn of its great age, that had never yet seen a pyramid, a great river, and a desert of the dead in the west, a capital city called Memphis, and a burial plateau above it called Saqqara, a king named Nechereket, whom we call Djoser, the son of kings, the sacred guardian of the ordered world, who would build something the world had never seen, and a set of beliefs already deep and old, that the body must be preserved, that a life force called the Ka lived on and needed a home of stone, that the king's renewal could continue forever through the eternal jubilee, and that the dead king rose to join the imperishable stars in the northern sky. These are the threads we will follow tonight, down into the dark beneath the steps, where a king lay down in the hope of rising again, forever. Keep all of this in your mind softly as we go forward. For it is the frame on which the whole night hangs, the Ka that lives on and must be housed and fed, the statue of stone that gives the Ka a body that cannot decay, the jubilee that renews the king forever, the imperishable stars that the king rises to join, and over it all, the sacred king himself, the guardian of order, whose safe passage into eternity mattered not only to him, but to the whole of the ordered world. These were not idle fancies to the Egyptians. They were the deepest truths they knew, and they built them into stone on a scale that still astonishes us 4,500 years later. Everything we are about to see, the granite vault, the empty sarcophagus, the watching statue, the second tomb, the eternal courtyards, was an expression of these beliefs, made solid, made permanent, made to last forever. To walk through Djoser's complex, then, is to walk through a vision of eternity itself, frozen in stone at the very dawn of the great age of the pyramids. Let us follow him now, gently, into his eternity. So here we are, at the heart of the matter, the death of King Djoser, and the long journey his people built to carry him beyond it. This is the deepest part of our night, so we will move through it slowly, in several stages, descending step by step and circling back often so that even if you drift, the thread is never lost. We will begin at the moment of death. We will follow the body into the dark. We will descend the great shaft to the granite vault. We will stand before the empty sarcophagus and ask what became of the king. We will meet the watching statue in its sealed box, and we will walk the eternal courtyards built for the king's endless renewal. The thread we follow is the journey itself, the passage of a sacred king from the brief life of the body into the long life among the stars. Let us begin, then, with the death of the king. How did Djoser die? Here at once, we meet the silence that surrounds so much of his story. We do not know. Unlike some kings of Egypt, no account survives of the manner of his death. No record of a wound, an illness, an accident, an age. He reigned, by the best estimates, for around 19 years, perhaps longer, and then he died. Most likely as an older man, at the end of a long and powerful reign, having very nearly completed the most ambitious monument the world had yet seen. Whether death came suddenly or slowly, in sickness or in peace, we cannot say. The records of this earliest age do not tell us, and his body, as we will see, has not survived to be examined. So we must let that first question rest, gently, unanswered. The king died. The how is lost to time. What matters for our story is what came next, for it is in what the living did with the dead king that the true wonder of this night lies. When a king of Egypt died, the world, for a time, was thrown into a kind of suspended danger. The guardian of order had fallen. The living link between the people and the powers they revered was broken, and the great task that now fell to the living was to carry the dead king safely through the perilous passage of death and into his eternity, so that order might be restored, so that the new king might take the throne, and so that the dead king might continue from the afterlife to bless and protect the land. So the death of Djoser set in motion a vast and solemn machinery, the machinery of the royal funeral and of the eternal monument that had been prepared to receive him. First came the preparation of the body. The Egyptians believed, as we have seen, that the survival of the person was bound up with the survival of the body, and so the body of the dead king had to be preserved against decay. In Djoser's age, at the very dawn of the Old Kingdom, the elaborate art of preservation that we call mummification, the art that would, in later centuries, produce the famous wrapped mummies of Egypt, with their resins and their linen and their painted coffins, was still early in its development. The techniques were not yet what they would become, but the impulse was already old and deep to clean, to anoint, to wrap, to preserve, to make the body last. The king's body would have been carefully treated, dried, anointed with oils and resins and wrapped in fine linen, prepared by skilled hands for the eternity ahead. We have, from tombs of this general age, evidence of bodies wrapped with great care, their limbs individually bound, sometimes modeled in resin, soaked linen to preserve the shape of the living form. The dead king would have been prepared with all the art his age could command, and made ready for the journey into the dark. And here we come to one of the strange and haunting facts of our story, one we must hold honestly. We do not have the body of King Djoser. When the burial chamber beneath the pyramid was finally explored in modern times, the king was gone. We will come to what was found there and what was not. But let us mark it now. At the start, the mummy of the first pyramid king, the body that all this vast machinery was built to preserve and protect, has not survived. Like so many of the kings of Egypt, Djoser was robbed, his tomb broken into and plundered, very likely within centuries of his burial and across the long ages that followed. The body itself vanished. We will return to this for now, follow the body as it was meant to go, down into the dark. For the heart of the monument, the true destination of the king, lay not in the great stepped pyramid that rose above the desert, but deep beneath it, in the rock. Let us descend there now slowly, in our minds. At the center of the pyramid, a great shaft had been sunk straight down into the bedrock, a vast square pit, descending some 28 meters into the rock, deeper than a modern building of many stories is tall. At the bottom of that shaft, the builders had constructed the burial chamber itself, a vault built of granite, a hard, dark, heavy stone that had to be brought from far up the river in the deep south of Egypt and hauled across the land at enormous effort. Granite, the hardest and most enduring of stones, for the most precious and most protected place of all, the chamber where the king's body would lie. And it gets stranger and more ingenious the more closely you look at how that chamber was built and sealed. For the granite vault had no ordinary door. Instead, it was entered from above through a round hole in its ceiling, and after the king's body had been lowered into the vault, that hole was sealed with an enormous plug of granite, a great cylindrical stopper of stone, weighing more than 3 tons, lowered into place from a chamber above to block the opening forever. Picture the scene at the funeral. The body of the king lowered down the deep shaft into the granite vault at the bottom. The funeral rites performed, and then the great granite plug, weighing as much as a small herd of cattle, lowered slowly down by ropes, through grooves cut to guide it, settling into the round opening, sealing the king into his vault of stone. The builders had even prepared a special chamber above the vault, which the archaeologists who studied it would call the maneuver chamber, where the great plug was stored and the apparatus set up to lower it into place after the burial. Everything was designed for one purpose: to seal the king's body into the hardest stone available, deep beneath a mountain of more stone, beyond the reach, the builders hoped, of any who might disturb his rest. And around that central vault, the builders had carved something extraordinary, a vast labyrinth. Beneath the pyramid, sunk into the rock, ran a maze of tunnels and corridors and chambers, branching and turning, descending and connecting on a scale never attempted before. Galleries ran off in many directions. Chambers opened from the corridors. The whole subterranean structure beneath the pyramid would, in total, stretch for kilometers of passages and contain hundreds of rooms. Some of these were storerooms, meant to hold the goods the king would need in eternity. Some were galleries packed with offerings, and the maze itself served a purpose beyond storage, a tangle of passages to confuse and discourage the robbers who, the builders surely knew, would come seeking the treasures of a king. We will explore that labyrinth more fully when we come to the strange and the unexplained, but for now hold the image beneath the stepped mountain, a deep shaft to a granite vault, sealed with a great stone plug, and all around it a maze of tunnels reaching out into the dark rock. A buried world built for a dead king. Now let us speak of what was found in that vault, in modern times when the long sealed dark was finally opened, for it is here that our central mystery comes into focus. When archaeologists reached the burial chamber beneath the pyramid, they found that they were far from the first to do so. Robbers had been there long before, in ancient times, breaking through the rock, plundering the king's treasures, disturbing his rest. The chamber had been violated and emptied, and of the king's sarcophagus, the great stone coffin that had held his body, only fragments remained. In careful modern conservation work in the burial chamber, some 32 fragments of the king's granite sarcophagus were recovered, and from these broken pieces, the archaeologists could estimate that the sarcophagus had originally weighed well over 1.5 tons of solid granite. But of the body it had held, of the king himself, there was nothing certain. The sarcophagus was empty and broken. The king was gone, robbed, scattered, dissolved into the long ages. The body that the granite vault and the great stone plug and the labyrinth of tunnels had all been built to protect was, in the end, not protected at all. The robbers had come, as robbers always came, and the king's eternity of stone had not kept his body safe. There is a deep and quiet irony in that, and it runs through the whole story of the pyramids, from the very first of them. The more a king built to protect his body, the more treasure he gathered around it, the more surely he drew the robbers who would, in the end, undo all his work. Djoser built the first pyramid, the first great machine for eternity, with its granite vault and its 3-ton plug and its labyrinth of tunnels. And still the robbers came, and still the body was lost. All that stone, all that labor, all that faith, and the one thing it was meant to preserve slipped away. And yet, and this is the turn that saves the story from sorrow, the loss of the body was not, to the Egyptians, the loss of everything. For they had built, into the very design of the monument, a second home for the king, a backup against exactly this disaster. And that brings us, at last, to the sealed box on the north side of the pyramid, and to the statue that waits inside it, staring forever at the stars. So let us go back up out of the dark shaft and around to the north face of the great stepped pyramid, where, leaning against the stone, there stands a small sealed box of limestone, tilted slightly back, with two small round holes cut into its front. The Egyptians called such a structure a serdab, a word that comes like mastaba from a much later language meaning a cellar or an underground room. This serdab was a small, fully enclosed chamber of fine limestone, sealed on every side with no door, no way in or out, except for those two small holes in the front wall, cut at the height of a seated person's eyes. And inside that sealed box, hidden from every living eye, sat a statue, a life-sized statue of King Djoser himself, seated on his throne, wrapped in a long ceremonial cloak, wearing a striped headcloth and a ceremonial beard. His hands resting on his lap, his eyes, once inlaid with polished rock crystal, so that they would catch the light and seem to live, gazing straight ahead, out through the two small holes toward the northern sky. This statue is one of the great treasures of early Egypt. It is the oldest known life-sized statue of an Egyptian king, perhaps the oldest life-sized royal statue in the world. A portrait in stone of the first pyramid king made more than 4,500 years ago. The original now rests in a museum, kept safe. A copy sits in the serdab in its place, still staring north through the holes. But its purpose was never to be admired. Its purpose was to be a home for the king's K. Remember the belief, the Ka, the life, force that survived death, needed a body to dwell in, and if the real body should fail, should decay, or be destroyed, or be stolen away by robbers, then a statue, an image of the king in enduring stone, could serve as its home instead. The sealed statue in the serdab was exactly that, a body of stone for the king's Ka, sealed safely away where no robber would think to look. A backup against the loss of the real body. And so, when the robbers came and took the king's mortal remains from the granite vault, the Ka, the Egyptians believed, still had its home, the watching statue, sealed in its limestone box, untouched, gazing forever at the stars that never set. And why the two small holes? Why was the statue made to see? Here we touch something quietly beautiful. The Ka dwelling in the statue was not meant to sit in eternal darkness. Through those two small holes the statue, and the Ka within it, could look out. It could watch the rituals performed for the king on the north side of the pyramid, where priests would bring offerings and burn incense for the dead king's Ka. It could receive, through those openings, the smoke of the incense and the sustenance of the offerings. And above all, it could gaze northward, toward that region of the sky where the imperishable stars wheel and never set. The stars the king was believed to have risen to join. The statue's eyes were fixed, for eternity, on the king's celestial destination. The K, in its house of stone, looked out through two small holes at the eternal stars, watching the place where the king now lived forever. There is something almost unbearably moving in that image, when you let it settle in the dark. A king, dead for 4,500 years, his body lost, his treasures stolen, his monument plundered, and still, in a sealed box on the north side of the first pyramid, a statue with crystal eyes, gazing out through two small holes at the stars that never die, waiting, watching, enduring. But the watching statue was only one part of the great machine of eternity, and to understand the king's journey fully, we must walk the courtyards above. In the open air, where a different kind of immortality was built in stone, the immortality of endless renewal. Come back up then from the dark and into the great enclosure, and let us walk it slowly. The whole complex was ringed by an enormous wall of pale limestone, taller than several men standing one upon another, its surface carved to imitate the recessed and paneled façade of a great royal palace. Within that wall lay not a single building but a whole stone city, courtyards and chapels and shrines and platforms, spread across an area larger than some entire towns of the age, and much of it was built for one purpose above all, to let the dead king perform, forever, the great festival of his renewal. Remember the Jubilee, the said festival, the ritual of renewal in which a king, after long years on the throne, demonstrated that his powers were undiminished, ran his ceremonial course, and was crowned anew. In life, a king might celebrate it once, or a few times across a long reign, but Djoser's complex was built so that he could celebrate it forever. In the afterlife, again and again, without end. There is a great open court, the South Court, stretching along the southern side of the pyramid, and in it stand a pair of curious curved stones, set apart from one another. Boundary markers, the markers of the ritual run. In the Jubilee, the king ran a course between such markers, a symbolic circuit of his land, showing his vigor before the assembled powers. And here, in the eternal court, the markers were set in stone so that the king's Ka could run that course forever, renewing his kingship for all eternity beneath the open sky in the shadow of his pyramid. Picture it, a great empty court of pale stone, silent now where a dead king was meant to run. Again and again, through all the ages, never tiring, never aging, renewed without end. And there is more, for along one side of the complex lies the said court, the Jubilee court proper, lined with rows of chapels. And these chapels hold one of the strangest and most revealing secrets of the whole monument. They are dummies. They are false buildings. From the outside, they look like shrines, like the chapels in which the powers of Upper and Lower Egypt would be honored during the Jubilee festival. Some shaped like the shrines of the south, some like the shrines of the north, representing the two lands gathered for the king's renewal. But they are not real buildings. They have no true interiors, or only shallow false ones. Many were built solid or filled with rubble, their doors merely carved imitations that do not open. They were never meant to be entered by the living. They were built for the king's Ka, for the eternal Jubilee stage scenery in solid stone, a permanent setting for a festival that would be performed forever by a dead king and the unseen powers of his land. The Egyptians built false buildings, false doors, false shrines, not out of deception, but because, in their understanding, the stone image of a thing could serve its purpose in eternity, as well as the real thing served it in life. A carved door the Ka could pass through. A dummy shrine could host an eternal rite. The whole court was a theater of stone for the endless renewal of the king. This idea that an image in stone could do the work of the real thing forever runs all through the complex, and nowhere more than in the false doors set into the great enclosure wall. The wall had many gateways carved into it, but almost all of them were false doors of solid stone, carved to look like real doorways with their panels and their frames, but with no opening, no passage through. There was only one true entrance for the living. All the rest were false doors, and they were not mistakes or decorations. They were portals for the Ka. The Egyptians believed that the Ka, the life force of the dead, could pass through a false door, moving between the world of the tomb and the world beyond, where a living person could not. The false door was a threshold between the realms, a doorway only the dead could use. So the great wall around Djoser's eternity was pierced with doorways for his Ka to come and go, while remaining sealed against the living, a boundary between the world of the dead king and the world of the living, with doors that opened only for the spirit. Now let us go down again, into the dark. For there is a hidden palace beneath the pyramid that we have not yet seen, and it is among the most beautiful things in all of early Egypt. Deep beneath the monument, among the maze of tunnels, the builders created a series of chambers meant to serve as the king's palace in the afterlife, his royal apartments for eternity. And they lined the walls of these chambers with thousands upon thousands of small tiles of blue-green faience, a glazed and gleaming material set into the stone to imitate the woven reed mats and hangings that adorned the walls of a real royal palace. Imagine descending into the dark by torchlight and coming upon walls that shimmer blue, green in the flame, thousands of glazed tiles glinting like water, like the sky, like the reed mats of the king's own palace, recreated in eternal, shining stone, deep beneath the earth. And set among these gleaming walls were carved panels, stelae showing the king himself, striding, running the Jubilee course, visiting the shrines of the powers his people revered, including the figure they called Horus, the falcon, the protector of kings. These reliefs are among the finest carvings to survive from the whole of early Egypt, delicate and precise and full of life. And here is the strange and telling thing. The Egyptians placed their finest art, their most beautiful and skilled work, in the darkest, most hidden, most inaccessible place in the entire complex, deep underground, where no living eye would ever see it. They did not make this beauty to be admired. They made it for the king's Ka, for the dead king's eternal dwelling. A shining palace in the dark, a home fit for a king among the stars. That tells you, more than almost anything, what the whole monument was truly for. It was not built to impress the living, at least not in its deepest places. It was built for the dead, in the sincere and total belief that the dead king would dwell there forever. And there is one more wonder in the depths, a quieter one, that speaks of the king's bond with those who came before him. In the galleries beneath the pyramid, the builders deposited an astonishing hoard, tens of thousands of vessels of stone, finely carved bowls and jars and dishes, many of them inscribed with the names of kings who had reigned before Djoser in the dynasties that came before his own. Why they were gathered there, no one can say for certain. Some scholars believe Djoser collected these vessels from the damaged or plundered tombs of his ancestors and reburied them in his own monument, to keep them safe, to honor the kings who had gone before, and perhaps to gather their accumulated power and legitimacy into his own eternity. Others believe they came from the storehouses of temples, gathered for the king's use in the afterlife. Whatever the reason, the image is a striking one. The first pyramid king, building his eternity, surrounded himself in the dark with the sacred vessels of all the kings who had come before him, as though gathering his ancestors close, as though the first great monument of the new age should hold within it the memory of the old. The dead king did not go into eternity alone. He went surrounded by the names and the vessels of his forebears, the whole royal past gathered into the depths of his pyramid. There is one more part of the king's eternity we must visit before we gather the threads, and it is among the strangest of all, a second tomb at the southern edge of the great complex, for Djoser was not given only the great burial vault beneath the pyramid. At the far south of the enclosure, the builders constructed another descending passage, another tunnel sinking some 30 meters into the rock, leading down to a second granite chamber. And here is the puzzle. This second burial chamber is far too small to have held a human body. A king could not have been buried in it. So what was it for? Scholars have wondered over this southern tomb for a long time, and they have offered several answers, none of them certain. Some believe it was meant to house the king's Ka, a second resting place for his life, force separate from the body. Some believe it may have held the king's internal organs, removed during the preparation of the body and stored apart, though this does not quite match what later kings did. And many believe it was symbolic, that Djoser, as the ruler of the two lands, the south and the north, was given two tombs to express his double kingship, one beneath the pyramid and one at the south. Just as later kings would be given a small secondary pyramid beside their great one. Whatever its precise purpose, this southern tomb is a marvel in its own right. Down its deep passage in the dark, the builders created more of those shining chambers lined with blue-green faience imitating the king's palace. And set into the walls were carved panels, showing the king once again running the Jubilee course, striding in his ritual of renewal. And these southern carvings are, if anything, even finer and better preserved than those beneath the pyramid, more of that exquisite art, hidden in the deepest dark, made for a dead king's eyes alone. Two tombs. Then, for one king, the great vault beneath the mountain of steps, and the smaller, deeper secret chamber at the south, both built to carry him into an eternity we can only partly understand. Let us pause now and imagine the day itself, The funeral of the king. For though we have no record of it, we can picture its shape from what we know of Egyptian custom, and from the monument that received him. When Djoser died, his body, prepared and wrapped over many days, would have been carried in solemn procession from the city of the living, across the river, up onto the desert plateau, to the great walled complex that had been raised for his eternity. Imagine the procession winding up from the valley, the body of the sacred king borne on a bier, or drawn upon a sledge, wrapped in fine linen, perhaps placed within a shrine behind it, the new king and the queen, and the royal household, and the priests in their leopard skins, and the officials of the court, and the mourners, and around them, the offerings, the goods, the treasures that would go into the dark with the king. Through the single true entrance in the great pale wall they would pass, into a long narrow colonnade where tall stone columns, carved to imitate bundles of reeds, rose on either side like a forest of stone, leading the procession inward, out of the bright desert light, and into the cool shadow of the king's eternal house. There the rites would be performed, the prayers spoken, the offerings made, and then the body carried to the great shaft and lowered down into the dark, to the granite vault where it would be sealed beneath the 3-ton plug of stone, while above the living completed the rituals that would launch the king toward the stars. And among those rituals, one above all was meant to bring the dead king and his statue back to a kind of life, a ceremony the Egyptians called the opening of the mouth. They believed that a body or a statue standing in for the body had to be ritually awakened before it could receive offerings, before the K could truly dwell in it and be sustained. In the opening of the mouth, a priest would touch the mouth, the eyes, the ears, the nose of the dead king's image with special implements, ritually opening the senses so that the king or his Ka, dwelling in the statue, could once more see and hear and breathe, and above all eat, could receive the food and drink, the bread and beer, the incense and offerings that the living would bring to sustain him through eternity. Picture that ceremony performed upon the watching statue in its serdab, or upon the king's image in the temple. The priest's careful touch, the whispered words, the senses of the dead king awakened in stone. From that moment, the Egyptians believed the king's K could live in the statue, look out through its crystal eyes, and receive the offerings brought to it forever. The statue was not merely a portrait. It was, once awakened, a living home for the dead king's life, force, a body of stone that could see the stars and receive its daily bread. For the king's eternity was not a thing that, once sealed, looked after itself. It had to be served daily by the living. On the north side of the pyramid, beside the serdab with its watching statue, stood a temple, a mortuary temple, a place where priests would come, day after day, to perform the rituals for the dead king's Ka, to bring offerings of food and drink, to burn incense, to recite the prayers, to sustain the king in his eternity. This was the great unspoken bargain of the Egyptian tomb. The dead king would be cared for by the living, his Ka fed and tended through an endless cult of offerings, and in return, the dead king, from among the imperishable stars, would bless and protect the land and the living who served him. A whole institution grew up around this: priests, lands, revenues, all dedicated to the eternal service of the dead king's Ka. For a time after Djoser's death, that service would have been carried out faithfully. The offerings brought, the incense burned, the statue tended in its sealed box. And the remarkable thing, as we will see, is how very long the memory and the reverence for this particular king endured. Long after the offerings stopped, long after the cult faded, the name of Djoser was still spoken with awe for century upon century. Step back now, in your mind, and see the whole of it together. This machine for eternity, the first of its kind. Above the desert, the great stepped mountain of pale stone, climbing in 6 stages toward the sky, visible for miles. The eternal house of the king. Around it, the vast walled enclosure, a stone city of courtyards and chapels and shrines. The south court with its boundary stones, where the king would run his jubilee forever. The Heb, said court, with its dummy shrines of the 2 lands, a stone theater for the endless festival of renewal, the false doors in the walls, portals for the K to pass between the worlds, the mortuary temple on the north, where the living would serve the dead king's cat, the serdab with its watching statue, gazing through two small holes at the imperishable stars, and below, in the dark, the deep shaft to the granite vault, the labyrinth of tunnels, the shining chambers of blue tile, the exquisite carvings made for no living eye, the gathered vessels of the ancestors, and the second secret tomb at the south. Every part of it, above and below, built for one purpose, to carry one man past death, and to keep carrying him forever, to house his caw, to renew his kingship, to sustain him with offerings, and to launch him upward to join the stars that never set. It is, when you see it whole, one of the most complete and astonishing visions of eternity that human beings have ever built. And it was the first. Nothing like it had ever stood on the earth before Djoser, and there may be a deeper meaning still in the very shape of the monument, in those 6 great steps climbing toward the sky. For many scholars have wondered whether the stepped form was not merely an architectural stage on the way to the smooth pyramids that came later, but a thing of meaning in itself, a stairway, a giant staircase of stone, rising in 6 vast steps from the desert toward the heavens, by which the dead king might climb, or his spirit ascend, up out of the tomb and into the sky, to join the imperishable stars. We cannot be certain that this was the builder's intention. The monument grew through several stages of design, and its meaning may have shifted as it rose. But the idea is a powerful and fitting one, and it sits beautifully with everything else we have seen. The watching statue gazes north toward the stars that never set. The king's spirit was believed to ascend to join them, and the monument itself, rising in 6 great steps toward the sky, may have been conceived as the very stairway of that ascent, a ladder of stone reaching from the world of the dead toward the eternal stars. If so, then the first pyramid was not only a tomb, and not only a machine of renewal, but a road into the sky, built in stone, for a king to climb beyond death. Whether or not the builders meant it so, there is no mistaking the upward reach of the thing, the way it climbs and climbs toward the heavens, as though straining to lift the king out of the earth and into the light above. To the people of the valley below, watching it rise against the sky, it must have seemed exactly that. A stairway built by their king to climb out of death and into the company of the stars, the first such road that any people had ever dared to build. So let us gather ourselves here, for we have descended far and climbed back and descended again through the whole machine of the king's eternity. So here is where we are. The king died, of causes lost to time. At the end of a long reign, his body was prepared with the early art of preservation, and carried into the great monument. It was lowered down a deep shaft to a granite vault, sealed with an enormous stone plug, surrounded by a labyrinth of tunnels meant to protect and confuse. And yet the robbers came, and the body was lost, the sarcophagus broken and emptied. But the king's eternity was not undone, for the Egyptians had built far more than a tomb. They had built a second home for his K in the watching statue, sealed in its box, gazing forever north at the imperishable stars. They had built great courtyards where the king could run his jubilee and be renewed forever. They had pierced the walls with false doors for his K to pass through. They had hidden, in the dark beneath the pyramid, a shining palace of blue tile and exquisite carving, a dwelling for the dead king fit for eternity. And they had gathered around him, in the depths, the sacred vessels of all the kings who came before. This was not a grave. It was a machine for eternity, the first of its kind built in stone at the dawn of the age of pyramids. And to understand how it fit into the long story of Egyptian belief, how the king's stellar eternity related to what came before and what would come after, we must widen our view. And that is where our journey turns next. For Djoser's eternity did not stand alone in time. It grew out of the simpler tombs of his ancestors, and it became the seed from which all the great pyramids and their afterlife beliefs would grow. The first machine for eternity was also a beginning, and the story of what it began is itself a wonder worth telling. So let us rise now out of the dark beneath the steps, and look at the wider world of death and eternity into which the king's great monument was set. So we have stood in the very heart of Djoser's eternity. The granite vault, the watching statue, the courtyards of endless renewal, the shining chambers in the dark. Now let us widen our view and see how this one king's journey into the afterlife fit into a far longer story. The story of how the Egyptians buried their kings before Djoser, how they would bury them after him, and how the beliefs about death and eternity grew and changed across the ages. All of it turning, in a sense, on the great hinge that was the first pyramid, for Djoser's monument did not appear from nothing, and it did not stand alone. It was the culmination of what came before, and the seed of everything that came after. Let us look first at what came before, at how the kings of Egypt were laid to rest in the centuries before Djoser. The first kings of the United Land, the rulers of the very first dynasties, were buried far to the south, at a sacred site called Abydos, in the desert that had been the ancestral burial ground of the southern kings from whom the line first sprang. There, in tombs of mud brick sunk into the sand, the earliest kings were laid to rest, surrounded by storerooms of goods, and in the very earliest age by the graves of servants who seemed to have been sent to accompany their king into death. And at Abydos, the kings also raised great enclosures of mud brick, vast walled courts set apart from the tombs, where the rituals of the dead king were performed. So already before Djoser, the essential elements were present: a tomb for the body, an enclosure for the rituals, provisions for the afterlife, a belief in a life beyond death. But these things were separate, the tomb in one place, the ritual enclosure in another, and they were built of mud brick, the same humble material as the houses of the living, destined to crumble and melt back into the earth. What Djoser and his architect did, in their great monument at Saqqara, was to gather all these scattered elements together into a single unified design, and to translate them, for the first time, into stone. The tomb and the ritual enclosure, once separate, were now combined within one great walled complex. The mud brick of the ancestors became cut limestone, meant to last forever. The low, flat mastaba grew upward into a stepped mountain, and the whole was conceived as a single machine for the king's eternity, every part working together. This was the genius of the leap, not the invention of entirely new beliefs, but the gathering and the magnifying and the making permanent of old ones. Djoser took the funerary world of his ancestors, the tomb, the enclosure, the offerings, the hope of a life beyond, and he raised it up, unified it, and carved it into eternal stone on a scale no one had ever attempted, and in doing so he created the template that all the great kings after him would follow. For look at what came after. Djoser's immediate successors tried to build stepped pyramids of their own, though several were never finished, their unfinished bases still lying in the desert, abandoned when their kings died too soon. And then, within a few generations, the kings made the next great leap, from the stepped pyramid to the true pyramid. The smooth-sided pyramid with flat triangular faces rising to a single point. The kings of the dynasty after Djoser's experimented with the form, one pyramid that began too steep and had to be finished at a gentler angle, giving it a bent profile; another, the first true smooth pyramid, rising clean and straight from the desert. And then, at last, came the greatest of them all, the great pyramid of Giza, raised by a king of the fourth dynasty, the largest stone monument of the ancient world, the only one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, still standing today. From Djoser's 6 rough steps to the smooth perfection of Giza was a journey of only a few generations, and every step of that journey grew from the seed that Djoser planted. He built the first, they built the greatest. But the greatest could not have existed without the first. And the beliefs about the afterlife grew and shifted across that same span in ways that are worth pausing on, for they show how the religion of eternity evolved. In Djoser's age, as we have seen, the emphasis was strongly on the stars, the dead king ascending to join the imperishable stars of the northern sky. the eternal ones that never set. But as the centuries passed, and the age of the Great Pyramids unfolded, the emphasis shifted increasingly toward the sun. The kings of the later Old Kingdom came to be associated above all with the figure the Egyptians called Re, whom they connected with the sun, and the pyramid itself came to be seen as a thing of the sun. Its shape, some have suggested, evoking the rays of sunlight slanting down to earth, or the sacred mound on which the sun was believed to have first risen. The smooth pyramid, gleaming in white limestone, blazing in the desert sun, was a solar monument in a way the stepped pyramid had not quite been. And later still, the beliefs shifted again, weaving in the figure the Egyptians called Osiris, whom they revered as the Lord of the Dead and the promise of rebirth, until the royal afterlife became a rich blend of stellar, solar, and Osirian hopes. Djoser stands near the beginning of all this, at the stellar dawn before the full rise of the solar and the Osirian. His was an eternity of stars more than of sun, and watching how those beliefs changed across the monuments of the kings is like watching a great slow tide of the human imagination, rising and shifting and deepening across the centuries, all of it beginning, in a sense, with the first king who dared to build his eternity in stone. Let us widen the view further still, to the place itself, to Saqqara, the desert plateau that Djoser made famous, for his monument transformed it forever. Before Djoser, Saqqara was a cemetery of nobles' mastabas. After Djoser, it became one of the most sacred and sought-after burial grounds in all of Egypt, and it remained so for thousands of years. For century after century, the great ones of Egypt wished to be buried near the first pyramid, near the monument of the revered first king. The plateau filled with tombs, the tombs of nobles and officials, of priests and viziers, spanning nearly the entire length of Egyptian history, from Djoser's age down through the dynasties, into the age of the Greeks and the Romans. Beneath the sand around Djoser's pyramid lies one of the richest archaeological landscapes in the world, layer upon layer of tombs, a necropolis that grew up in the shadow of the first pyramid, and never stopped growing. Djoser's monument was the seed not only of the pyramids, but of the whole sacred landscape of Saqqara, the burial place of a civilization, clustered around the eternal house of the king who had built the first one. And here we come to one of the most striking parts of the wider story, how very long and how deeply this one king was remembered. Most kings, even great ones, fade from memory within a few generations. But Djoser was not forgotten. Across the long ages of Egyptian history, his memory endured and even grew. We have already noted that the very name by which we know him, Djoser, was not his name in life. In life he was Necheriki, but a name of honor given to him by Egyptians who lived more than 1,000 years after his death, and who carved that name of reverence beside his ancient monument, as a pilgrim might. Think about that. 1,000 years after he died, a span longer than separates us from the early Middle Ages, Egyptians were still visiting his pyramid, still honoring his memory, still adding to his name. And it did not stop there. Even 2,000 years and more after his death, in the very last ages of ancient Egypt, under the rule of the Greek kings who came after Alexander, Djoser was still remembered, still revered, still woven into the stories and the sacred traditions of Egypt. Few human beings have ever been remembered so long or so warmly. And the reasons for that long memory, the legends that gathered around him, the sense that he was a founder and a savior, belong to another night's story. But it is worth marking here, in the story of his eternity, that the king who built the first machine for eternity did, in a sense, achieve a kind of eternity after all. Not perhaps the eternity among the stars that he hoped for, but the eternity of memory, of a name spoken with reverence across thousands of years, and indeed still spoken by us tonight. Let us return for a moment to the successors of Djoser, for their efforts to follow him cast a poignant light on his own achievement, and one of them gives us a haunting echo of the empty vault we found beneath Djoser's pyramid. The king who came after Djoser, a ruler named Sekhemkhet, began his own step pyramid at Saqqara, not far from Djoser's, clearly meaning to match or surpass his predecessor. But he died too soon, and his pyramid was never finished. Today it survives only as a buried, ruined base, hidden beneath the sand for so long that it is sometimes called the buried pyramid. And when archaeologists explored its sealed burial chamber in modern times, they found something extraordinary: a sealed alabaster sarcophagus, its closure still apparently intact, with the remains of funeral offerings, a small wreath lying upon it. Hopes ran high that here, at last, an undisturbed royal burial of this earliest age had been found. And when the sealed sarcophagus was opened, it was empty. There was no body inside. Whether the king was never buried there, or whether his burial was an empty ritual, or whether some ancient mystery we cannot now recover took place, no one knows. But the echo is striking: another early king, another great stone coffin, another emptiness where a body should have been. The eternity these kings built in stone so often ended in an empty vault. Other successors tried too: a king named Kaba, whose unfinished pyramid is known as the layer pyramid, built up in accreting layers much like Djoser's first design. The step pyramid, it turned out, was hard to complete, and several of these early attempts were abandoned when their kings died. And then came the breakthrough into the true pyramid, in the dynasty that followed, and it is one of the great stories of trial and error in the history of building. A king named Sneferu, the father of the king who would build the Great Pyramid, was the most prolific pyramid builder in all of Egyptian history, and through his monuments we can watch the form being perfected before our eyes. His first Great Pyramid, at a place called Midim, may have begun as a stepped pyramid, and was then filled out toward a smooth-sided form. But something went wrong, and much of its outer casing collapsed, leaving a strange tower rising from a mound of rubble, as it stands today. Undeterred, the king built another, at a place called Djoser, and this one was planned as a true smooth pyramid from the start. But partway up, the builders evidently feared it was too steep and might fail, and so they changed the angle halfway, giving the monument a distinctive bent profile. A pyramid that starts at one slope and finishes at a gentler one, the famous bent pyramid. And then, having learned from both, the king built a third, the first true smooth-sided pyramid ever completed, rising clean and straight from the desert, the monument we call the Red Pyramid. 3 pyramids for one king, a sequence of experiments, each teaching the next, the form being refined step by step until at last it was perfected. And then his son took that perfected form and raised it to its greatest scale in the Great Pyramid of Giza. From Djoser's 6 rough steps, through the collapse at Midim and the bend at Djoser, to the smooth perfection of the Red Pyramid and the colossal triumph of Giza, the whole astonishing leap took only a handful of generations. And it all began with the first king who dared to pile stone upon stone toward the sky. There is another thread in the wider story, and it concerns the words the Egyptians eventually carved to guide their kings into eternity. Djoser's pyramid, for all its wonders, contained no writings about the afterlife, no spells, no prayers, no descriptions of the king's journey beyond death carved upon its walls. The shining chambers held images, reliefs of the king, but not the great religious texts. Those would come later, for it was only some centuries after Djoser, near the end of the Old Kingdom, that the kings began to carve. On the walls of their burial chambers, the collection of spells and prayers and incantations that we now call the pyramid texts, the oldest substantial body of religious writing to survive from anywhere in the world. These texts, first carved in the pyramid of a later king named Unas, describe in soaring and mysterious language the journey of the dead king into the afterlife, his ascent to the sky, his joining of the imperishable stars, his transformation into an eternal being among the powers of the heavens. Reading them, we can hear, at last, in the Egyptians' own words, the beliefs that had been built silently into Djoser's monument centuries before. The idea of the king ascending to the stars that never set which Djoser's watching statue expressed in stone, is spoken aloud in the pyramid texts, in words of great beauty. So Djoser's eternity was built before the words existed to describe it, or before, at least, anyone thought to carve them in a tomb. His monument is the silent ancestor of those soaring texts. The belief made architecture before it was made poetry. Now let us follow the long memory of Djoser down through the ages, for it is one of the most remarkable things about him, and it shows how a king can become over time. Almost a legend in the centuries after his death. His cult was maintained, his monument tended, his memory kept. More than 1,000 years after he died in the great age of the New Kingdom, Egyptians still came to Saqqara to marvel at his pyramid, which by then was already ancient beyond reckoning. To them, Djoser was as distant in the past as the ancient world is to us. Visitors left admiring inscriptions on the walls of the old monuments, a kind of reverent graffiti, praising the beauty of what the ancestors had built, declaring that it was as though heaven itself had made it. One prince of that later age, a son of one of Egypt's greatest kings, devoted himself to seeking out and restoring the ancient monuments of the first kings, repairing what time had damaged, honoring the deeds of the distant past. An ancient Egyptian working to preserve monuments that were, even then, more than 1,000 years old. The reverence for Djoser and his age ran deep, and it lasted, and did not stop with the Egyptians of the dynasties. Even in the very last age of ancient Egypt, under the Greek kings who ruled after Alexander the Great, Djoser was still remembered, still woven into the sacred traditions of the land, still credited with great deeds, more than 2,000 years after he had died. A carved stone from that late age, set up on an island far up the river in the deep south, tells a story of how Djoser once saved Egypt from a terrible famine. A story we will explore on another night, but one that shows how, after 2,000 years and more, this king was still being remembered as a savior of his people. And the place he made sacred, Saqqara, went on being sacred for all of that time and longer. The plateau around his pyramid filled, over the centuries, with the tombs of countless generations, nobles, officials, priests, all wishing to rest near the monument of the first king. Strange and wonderful things accumulated there. A vast underground gallery where the sacred bulls the Egyptians revered were buried in enormous stone coffins, one after another. Across the ages, the tombs of viziers and high priests, their walls carved with exquisite scenes of daily life, burial after burial, layer upon layer, down through the dynasties and into the age of the Greeks and Romans. And somewhere in that sacred ground, many believe, lies the tomb of the man who designed Djoser's monument, the brilliant architect whose name the king honored by carving it beside his own. A man so revered that, like Djoser, he was remembered for thousands of years, and eventually came to be honored as a figure of wisdom and healing. His tomb has never been found, and the search for it continues to this day, somewhere in the sands of the necropolis that grew up around the first pyramid. So Saqqara, the place of Djoser's eternity, became the eternal resting place of a civilization, a sacred landscape that the first pyramid called into being, and that endured for thousands of years after the king who started it had gone into the dark. There is a quieter shift in the wider story that deserves a moment, for it shows how the treatment of death itself softened in the generations around Djoser. In the very earliest age, the age of the first kings buried at Abydos, the dead king did not always go into the grave alone. Around some of those earliest royal tombs lay rows of subsidiary graves, the burials of servants and retainers who appear to have been put to death, or to have died to accompany their king into the next world, to serve him there as they had in life. It was a dark practice, born of a belief in the king's continued existence so total that it could draw the living after the dead. But by Djoser's time, this practice had faded away. There are no great rings of sacrificed retainers around the first pyramid. The Egyptians had turned instead toward images and statues and models, figures of stone and wood, and later small servant, figures placed in tombs to serve the dead symbolically, so that no living person need die to accompany the king. Djoser's eternity was served not by the bodies of the slain, but by the watching statue, the carved reliefs, the false doors, the offerings of priests. In this too, the first pyramid marks a turning away from the human sacrifice of the dawn, toward a symbolic eternity served by art and ritual. It is one of the gentler developments of the age, and it sits quietly within the larger story of how the Egyptians refined their vision of death across the centuries. And there is a darker and more practical thread that runs through the whole history of the pyramids, beginning with Djoser's, the long, futile struggle against the robbers. From the very first, the builders knew that a king buried with treasure would draw thieves, and so they built ever more elaborate defenses, deep shafts, granite vaults, massive stone plugs, mazes of tunnels, hidden chambers, false passages. Djoser's monument had all of these: the deep shaft, the granite vault, the 3-ton plug, the labyrinth meant to confuse. And yet, as we have seen, the robbers came anyway, and the king's body was lost. This was the pattern that would repeat, again and again, across the whole age of pyramids. Each king built greater defenses each time. Sooner or later, the robbers found a way through. The Great Pyramid of Giza itself, the mightiest of them all, was robbed in antiquity, its burial chamber found empty, its king vanished. The pyramids were, in a sense, a vast and tragic arms race, the greatest builders of the ancient world pitting their stone against the patience and greed of thieves, and losing every time in the end. There is a hard lesson in that, running all the way back to Djoser, that no wall, however thick, no stone, however hard, no maze, however cunning, could finally protect the treasure of a dead king from the living who wanted it. The bodies were taken. The gold was stolen. Only the stone remained, and the name. And yet, consider what Djoser truly set in motion. Not only the pyramids, but an entire world of eternity, an economy and an institution of the afterlife that would last for 3,000 years. Around the dead king's cult grew priesthoods, endowed with lands and revenues to sustain the offerings forever. Around the building of the tombs grew a vast organization of quarrymen and haulers and masons and architects, a machinery of construction that the kingdom would refine across the centuries. Around the preparation of the body grew the craft of the embalmers, who would, in time, perfect the art of mummification into one of the wonders of the ancient world. Around the furnishing of the tomb grew the workshops of the craftsmen who made the statues, the vessels, the offerings, the treasures of eternity. A whole civilization organized itself, in part, around the care of the dead and the hope of a life beyond. And Djoser's monument stands near the headwaters of all of it, the first great expression of an idea that would shape Egyptian society, Egyptian religion, and Egyptian art for 3,000 years. When you stand before the first pyramid, you are standing not only before a tomb, but before the beginning of an entire way of facing death, a way that gathered up the wealth and the labor and the faith of one of history's great civilizations and turned them, generation after generation, toward the building of eternity. And there is one more way in which Djoser's monument reached beyond his own death, into the life of the living kingdom. For a project on such a scale did not only serve the dead king, it shaped the living state that built it. To raise the first pyramid, to quarry and haul and set its stone, to feed and house and organize the thousands who labored on it, required a degree of organization that Egypt had never before been called upon to muster. Someone had to plan the work, to gather the stone, to move it, to feed the workers, to coordinate the seasons of labor around the rhythm of the river and the harvest. Some scholars have argued that the building of the pyramids did as much to forge the Egyptian state as the Egyptian state did to build the pyramids, that the great national effort of raising these monuments helped to weld the kingdom together, to train its administrators, to bind its people to a common, sacred purpose. If that is so, then Djoser's monument was not only a machine for his eternity, but a forge for his kingdom, a project so vast that, in the building of it, Egypt itself was strengthened and unified, and made more fully into a single state. The first pyramid gave its king a road to the stars. It may also have given his kingdom a new and deeper unity, a shared and monumental purpose at the very dawn of its greatest age. The dead king's eternity, in other words, helped to build the living world that would, in turn, raise the greatest monuments the ancient world would ever see. And here is a thought to hold as we move toward the evidence, everything we have said in this wider story. The line of pyramids, the shift from stars to sun, the pyramid texts, the long memory of Djoser, the sacred growth of Saqqara, none of it was simply handed down to us. It had to be recovered, slowly, painfully, out of the sand and the ruin of thousands of years, by people who gave their lives to the work. The monument we have walked tonight was, for most of its long history, a buried and broken ruin, its courtyards drowned in drift sand, its tunnels collapsed and robbed, its meaning forgotten. That we can describe its chambers and its rituals and its place in history at all is the achievement of patient searchers across the last 2 centuries. So before we close, we must turn to them, and to the hard evidence, and to the strange and humbling things the search revealed. So the wider story of Djoser's eternity is the story of a great hinge in time. Behind him, the mud brick tombs and separate enclosures of the first kings, the simpler funerary world of the dawn. In his own monument, the gathering of all those elements into a single unified design, and their translation for the first time into eternal stone. Ahead of him, the stepped pyramids of his successors, the empty sarcophagus of Sekhemkhet, the experiments of Snefru, the smooth pyramids of the next age, the Great Pyramid of Giza, the soaring words of the pyramid texts, and the long evolution of the beliefs about the afterlife, from stars to sun to the Lord of the dead. Around him, the sacred plateau of Saqqara, growing for thousands of years in the shadow of his monument. And across all of it, the long, warm, astonishing memory of the king himself, revered for millennia after his death. Djoser's journey into the afterlife was not a single isolated event. It was the beginning of the whole great age of pyramids, and the seed of a vision of eternity that would shape Egyptian civilization for 3,000 years. It reached backward, gathering up the funerary world of the first kings. It reached forward into the smooth pyramids and the soaring texts of the ages to come, and it reached outward into the very organization of the living kingdom that built it. Few monuments in the whole story of humanity sit at the center of so many threads. But how do we know all this? How were the king's eternity and its secrets recovered? After so long in the dark, that is the story we turn to next. We have walked the whole of Djoser's eternity, from the granite vault to the watching statue, from the courtyards of renewal to the second tomb at the south, and we have said it in the wider story of Egyptian belief. But everything we have described was, for most of the last 4,500 years, lost, buried under sand, broken by robbers, forgotten by the living. So now we must ask the question that anchors all the rest. How do we actually know? What is the evidence? What has been found? And what remains? Even now, a mystery. For the recovery of Djoser's eternity is itself a long and patient story, and within it lie some of the strangest facts of all. Let us begin with the searchers, the people who, across the last 2 centuries, dug the first pyramid and its complex out of the sand, and learned to read what it meant. For a very long time, the monument stood as a great ruined mound in the desert, its stepped shape still rising above the sand, but its courtyards and chambers buried, its tunnels collapsed and choked. Early travelers and scholars noted it, sketched it, wondered at it. But the true recovery of the complex, the patient clearing and study and rebuilding that revealed it as we now understand it, was above all the work of one man, a French architect and archaeologist who devoted the better part of his life to Djoser's monument. For decade after decade, across the middle of the 20th century and beyond, he worked at Saqqara, clearing the sand, studying the fallen stones, and painstakingly piecing the complex back together, re-erecting columns, rebuilding walls, reconstructing chapels, recovering the shape of the king's eternity from a field of rubble. He spent something close to 70 years at the work, one of the longest devotions of a single archaeologist to a single site in the whole history of the field. It is largely thanks to him that we can walk Djoser's complex today and see its courtyards rise around us. Before him, others had begun the work, excavators in the earlier 20th century who first cleared parts of the complex and entered its chambers. And after him, and continuing into our own time, the work goes on. Conservation, restoration, study, the slow, careful tending of the oldest pyramid in the world. A great restoration of the monument was completed only in recent years, opening parts of it once more to those who come to see it. Let us linger on a few of the moments of discovery, for they are part of the wonder. Imagine the searchers of the earlier 20th century, working their way into the sealed serdab on the north side of the pyramid and coming face to face with the statue of the king, the crystal gone from its eyes, but the figure intact, seated and waiting in the dark where it had sat for 4,500 years. Imagine the first modern eyes to see the blue faience chambers deep beneath the pyramid, the torchlight catching thousands of glazed tiles gleaming blue, green in the dark, the king's hidden palace shining out of the rock after an age of silence. Imagine the labor of clearing the substructure, the kilometers of choked and collapsed tunnels, and the astonishment of finding gallery after gallery packed with stone vessels, tens of thousands of them, bowls and jars of fine stone, many inscribed with the names of kings who had reigned before Djoser. Each of these discoveries added a piece to the picture, and each was hard, one dug out of darkness and ruin by people working with brushes and baskets and endless patience. The Djoser complex we can describe so confidently tonight was assembled, piece by piece, from a field of broken stone, by generations of searchers who gave their working lives to it. And how do we know when Djoser lived? How do we place him in time? At around 4,700 years ago, in the 27th century before the Common Era. This is its own quiet detective story. The Egyptians themselves kept king lists, records of the rulers who had come before, copied and recopied down the centuries, and some of these survive. A great papyrus list, fragments carved on stone, the writings of a later Egyptian priest who compiled a history of the kings for the Greek rulers of his age. From these lists we can place Djoser in his dynasty, the third, near the start of the Old Kingdom, and reckon the generations. But the lists are damaged and they sometimes disagree, and counting backwards across thousands of years through reigns of uncertain length is a difficult thing. So scholars also turn to science, to the measurement of radioactive carbon in ancient organic remains, which decays at a known rate and so can give an approximate date for things like the wood, reed, and plant material used in the building. Studies of this kind, carried out on material from the early pyramids, have helped to anchor the chronology of the Old Kingdom, broadly confirming the traditional dates and placing Djoser's reign in the 27th century before the Common Era. The picture is not perfect. There is still debate among scholars over the exact years, and the length of Djoser's reign itself is uncertain, as we have seen. But the broad placement is secure. Djoser built the first pyramid some 4,500 years ago and more, near the dawn of the Age of Pyramids, well over a century before the Great Pyramid of Giza was raised. When you stand before his monument, you stand before something older than almost anything else human hands have built and left standing on the earth. We have spoken of the robbers, but let us be clear about the timeline of the loss as far as we can reconstruct it. The robbing of the pyramid was not a single event, but very likely a long process, beginning perhaps within centuries of the king's burial and continuing across the ages. Tomb robbers in ancient Egypt were a persistent plague. Even with all the defenses the builders devised, the lure of a king's treasure was too great, and those who knew the ground, sometimes it is thought, the very people who had helped to build or guard the tombs, found their way in. Over the long span of Egyptian history, the pyramid was entered and re-entered, plundered and reused. By the time the monument was studied in modern times, the burial chamber had been violated so thoroughly that only the shattered fragments of the sarcophagus and the disputed scraps of bone remained. The treasures, whatever gold and fine goods had gone into the dark with the king, were long gone, melted down, or carried off, untraceable. This is the fate of nearly every pyramid built to protect a body and its treasure for eternity, and emptied, in the end. By the patient greed of the living, the stone endured. The eternity of the body did not. Now let us turn to the hard evidence of the burial itself, and to the central mystery, the missing king. When the burial chamber beneath the pyramid was studied in modern times, the picture it told was clear and sad. The robbers had been there long before. The vault had been broken into, the burial plundered, the king's body taken or destroyed. But careful work in the burial chamber did recover something: the broken remains of the king's stone coffin. In conservation work documented by a leading Egyptian archaeologist, some 32 fragments of Djoser's granite sarcophagus were identified and recovered from the chamber. The numbers are striking. From those broken pieces, the researchers estimated that the sarcophagus, when whole, had weighed something on the order of 1.5 tons of solid granite, a single great coffin of hard stone, shattered by the robbers in the ages into 32 surviving fragments. And of the body that the great coffin had held, there was nothing certain to be found. The mummy of King Djoser is gone. The first pyramid king, who built the first great machine for eternity, lies nowhere that we can find. His body, like the bodies of so many of the pyramid kings, was lost to the robbers and to time. There is a further strange and disputed detail here, and we should treat it honestly. In the long history of the exploration of the pyramid, some human remains were recovered from the substructure, fragments of a body, including, by some accounts, part of a foot found in the chambers below. For a time there was hope that these might be the remains of Djoser himself, the last trace of the first pyramid king. But the matter is far from settled. The remains may belong to a later intrusive burial, or to some other person entirely, for tombs robbed and reused across thousands of years accumulate the traces of many bodies. Careful study has cast doubt on whether these fragments are Djoser at all, so we are left, honestly, with uncertainty, a shattered sarcophagus, 32 fragments of granite, a few disputed scraps of bone, and no sure trace of the king. The body that all that stone was built to protect has, in the end, escaped us as completely as it escaped the grasp of eternity. Let us turn now to the evidence of the king's beliefs, carved into the very fabric of the monument. For here the searchers found things of great beauty and meaning. There are the relief panels beneath the pyramid and in the south tomb, showing the king striding and running the jubilee before the shrines of the powers his people revered. There are the thousands of blue faience tiles, recovered from the underground chambers, gleaming still after 4,500 years, imitating the woven hangings of the king's palace. And there is the evidence of the stars. When the burial chamber and its surroundings were studied, traces were found suggesting that the ceiling had been planned to be carved with stars, limestone blocks bearing 5 pointed stars in low relief, meant to turn the ceiling of the vault into an image of the night sky. This is, as far as we know, the earliest appearance of the star ceiling, a tradition that would echo down through Egyptian tombs for thousands of years. It is hard evidence carved in stone of the belief we have followed all night, that the king sought to associate himself with the eternal stars of the northern sky, the imperishable ones that never set, so as to live among them forever. The watching statue gazing north, the planned ceiling of stars, these are not guesses. They are the physical traces of a belief, preserved in the stone of the first pyramid. And then there is the watching statue itself, perhaps the single most precious piece of evidence of all. The original statue of Djoser, recovered from its sealed serdab, is one of the great treasures of Egyptian antiquity. The oldest known life-sized statue of an Egyptian king, a portrait in stone of the first pyramid king, seated on his throne, wrapped in his cloak, his face grave and still. The crystal that once filled his eyes was gouged out by robbers in antiquity, who broke into even the sealed box to steal the glittering inlay, so that the statue's eyes are now hollow. But the figure endures, and it has been moved to safety in a museum, where it can be preserved, while a copy keeps its place in the serdab, still gazing north through the two small holes. To stand before that statue is to look into the face of a man who lived 4,500 years ago, the first king to build a pyramid, the first whose likeness in stone has come down to us at this scale. It is, in its way, the closest thing we have to the king himself. Not his lost body, but his face in stone, made to house his Ka, gazing still toward the stars. Now we must turn, as we always do on these nights, to the strange theories, the ideas that gather around the pyramids like mist, the claims that they were built by beings from beyond the earth, or by some lost and vanished civilization of impossible powers, or by means we cannot understand. These ideas attach themselves to the great pyramids of Giza above all, but they reach back to Djoser's pyramid too, as the first of the line, and so we should meet them honestly and see what the evidence actually says. The claim, in its various forms, is that human beings of the ancient past could not possibly have built such things, that the precision, the scale, the engineering, are beyond what people of that age could have achieved, and so some other explanation must be found, whether visitors from the stars or a forgotten supercivilization. And here the first pyramid of Djoser is, of all the pyramids, the best possible answer to those claims. For Djoser's monument is the one place where we can actually watch human beings learning to build in stone, with all their hesitations and changes of mind and visible trial and error written into the monument itself. We can see, in the structure of the step pyramid, that it was not conceived all at once as a finished design, but grew through stage after stage, beginning as a simple flat mastaba, then being enlarged, then being raised into steps, then enlarged again, the plan changing as the builders went, the seams between the stages still visible in the stone. We can see the builders feeling their way, solving problems as they arose, figuring out as they went how to do something no one had ever done before. This is not the work of perfect beings who arrived with complete knowledge. It is the work of brilliant, fallible, learning human beings, making the first attempt at something new and leaving the record of their learning in the very fabric of the monument. And the same is true across the whole line of pyramids. The collapse at Mitam, the bend at Djoser, the changes of angle and plan. These are the fingerprints of human trial and error, of people learning a difficult craft over generations. The pyramids do not show us superhuman perfection. They show us something far more moving human beings, working at the very edge of their ability, learning to build toward the sky, and getting better at it generation by generation. The mainstream understanding that these monuments were built by skilled and organized human beings over years, with the simple but powerful technologies of ramps and sledges and levers and immense coordinated labor, is not a failure of imagination. It is the conclusion the evidence forces upon us. And it is, in truth, a far greater tribute to the people of ancient Egypt than any tale of visitors from the stars. To say that humans could not have built the pyramids is to insult the very people who did. Let us take the strange claims a little further and answer them a little more fully, because they are worth dismantling with care. One version holds that a lost civilization of remote antiquity, far older and more advanced than ancient Egypt, built the pyramids, and that the Egyptians merely inherited them. But the evidence stands flatly against this. We can see the pyramids being developed, step by step, within Egyptian history itself, from the mud brick mastabas of the first kings, to Djoser's stepped pyramid with its visible stages of design, to the experiments of the next dynasty, to the smooth pyramids, and at last to Giza. We have the names of the kings who built them, carved into the monuments and recorded in the king lists. We have the quarries where the stone was cut, with the marks of the tools still on the rock. We have the remains of the workers' settlements where the builders lived and ate, and were themselves buried, their own modest tombs clustered near the great monuments they raised, sometimes inscribed with their titles and the names of their work gangs. We can trace the whole development, in place and in time, within Egypt by Egyptians. There is no gap where a lost civilization needs to be inserted, and no evidence that one ever existed. The pyramids are not an inheritance from some vanished super people. They are the achievement of the ancient Egyptians themselves, documented at every stage. Another version fixes on the supposed impossible precision of the monuments, the claim that they are aligned and cut and fitted with an accuracy beyond ancient means. But here too the first pyramid is instructive, for Djoser's monument is emphatically not a thing of flawless precision. Its blocks are relatively small. Its lines are not perfectly true. Its stages do not align with mathematical exactness. It is the work of builders who were still learning, and it shows. The greater precision of the later pyramids was not a starting point but an end point, the result of generations of accumulating skill, of masons and surveyors getting better and better at their craft, over a century and more of practice. The precision, where it exists, is itself evidence of a long human learning, not of superhuman or otherworldly origin. And even the famous alignments of the later pyramids toward the points of the compass and the stars are well within what careful observers of the sky, working patiently with simple instruments, could achieve. And indeed, the Egyptians' deep attention to the stars, which we have followed all night in the watching statue and the planned ceiling of stars, is exactly the kind of knowledge that would let them align their monuments to the heavens. The astronomy in the pyramids is real, and it is human, and it is the same astronomy that placed Djoser's statue facing the imperishable stars. So when you hear the strange tales, remember the first pyramid. Remember the visible stages of its design, the seams in its stone, the changes of plan, the hand of the learning builder everywhere upon it. Remember the collapse at Midian and the bend at Djoser, the honest record of trial and error. Remember the quarries, the tool marks, the workers' tombs, the king lists, the whole documented development of the form within Egyptian history. The pyramids are not a mystery in the sense the strange tales pretend. We know, in broad outline, who built them and when and how and why. What remains mysterious is finer and deeper. The exact meanings of particular chambers, the fate of particular bodies, the precise beliefs behind particular features. Those are real and lasting mysteries, and we have met several of them tonight. But the great question, could human beings have built this, has a clear and resounding answer. They could, they did, and the first of them to do it was the king whose eternity we have followed tonight. To say that humans could not have built the pyramids is once more to insult the very people who did, and to miss the true marvel, which is not that some impossible power raised these stones, but that ordinary mortal human beings with simple tools and immense organization and a burning belief in eternity raised them with their own hands. And we should be honest, too, about how much we still do not know, and how much still lies buried, for even the hard physical evidence does not always speak plainly. Consider once more the great hoard of stone vessels found in the galleries beneath the pyramid. Tens of thousands of them were recovered, many bearing the names of kings who reigned before Djoser, in the dynasties before his own. That much is certain. But why they are there, no one can finally say. Did Djoser gather them from the plundered or damaged tombs of his ancestors to keep them safe and to honor the dead kings within his own monument? Did they come from the storehouses of temples, swept up for the king's use in eternity? Were they a deliberate gathering of the royal past? A way of binding the memory and the legitimacy of all the earlier kings into the first pyramid? Each idea has its supporters, and the truth may be some blend of them, or something we have not yet imagined. The vessels are real, and the names upon them are real. But their meaning is still debated, a reminder that the first pyramid still holds questions we cannot fully answer, even when the evidence lies right before us. The deeper we dig into the first pyramid, the more we find that every answer it gives us arrives holding a new question by the hand. And so the work and the wonder go on. For all the patient work of 2 centuries, the sands of Saqqara have not given up all their secrets. The tomb of Djoser's brilliant architect has never been found, though it is believed to lie somewhere in the necropolis, and the search for it goes on. New tombs, new shafts, new chambers are still being discovered at Saqqara in our own time. Year after year, the plateau is so vast, and so deeply layered with the burials of thousands of years, that much of it remains unexplored. Beneath the sand around the first pyramid lies a buried world that we have only partly uncovered. And so the story of Djoser's eternity is not a closed book. It is an open excavation, still yielding its secrets, still surprising us, still holding mysteries we have not yet solved. Much of ancient Egypt, even now, lies waiting beneath the sand. The first pyramid has been studied for 200 years, and still it keeps its secrets. The manner of the king's death, the fate of his body, the full meaning of the second tomb, the resting place of his architect. We know so much, and still so little. And that, perhaps, is part of why these monuments hold us as they do. They are answers and questions at once, the most studied and the most mysterious structures on the earth. So that is the evidence and the strangeness within it. A monument dug from the sand by patient searchers across 2 centuries, a burial chamber robbed in antiquity, a sarcophagus shattered into 32 fragments, a king whose body is lost, a ceiling planned with stars, a statue gazing north, the physical traces of a belief in the imperishable stars. The first pyramid, which shows us not superhuman builders but human ones, learning their craft and leaving the record of their learning in the stone, and a vast buried landscape that still, to this day, keeps many of its secrets. From all of this patiently assembled, we have recovered the story of the king's journey into the afterlife. Not complete, never complete, but enough to stand in wonder before. And now, as our night draws toward its close, let us step back from the evidence and the stones and ask what all of it means. What does it mean that a man 4,500 years ago poured a kingdom's wealth into a doorway out of death? What does it mean that the doorway still stands while the man is gone? These are the questions that remain when the digging is done and the measuring is finished, and they are the ones that linger longest in the dark. Let us turn, gently, to the deeper meaning of it all. So we come, as the night grows late, to the deeper meaning of it all, to what the journey of King Djoser into the afterlife might say to us, across 4,500 years, about death and hope and what endures. We have followed the king down into the granite vault and back up to the watching statue. We have walked the courtyards of his endless renewal and stood before his face in stone. We have weighed the evidence and dismissed the strange tales. Now let us simply sit with what it means. Here is the first thing, and it is the heart of it. A man who lived 4,500 years ago looked at death, the same death that waits for all of us, that has always waited for everyone who has ever lived. And he refused to accept that it was the end. And not only did he refuse it in his heart, as we all do, he marshaled the wealth and the labor and the genius of an entire kingdom, for years, to build against it. He raised the first mountain of stone the world had ever seen, sank a shaft into the bedrock, carved a vault of granite, sealed it with stone weighing more than 3 tons, surrounded it with a labyrinth, set a watching statue to gaze at the eternal stars, and built courtyards where he might be renewed forever. All of it, every block, was an argument against death. All of it said, I will not simply end, there is more, and I will build my way toward it, in stone that will outlast everything. Let that sink in. The oldest colossal building on earth, the first pyramid, the ancestor of all the great monuments of Egypt, was raised as one man's refusal to accept that death is the end. It is, when you see it clearly, one of the most purely human things ever made. And here is the second thing, and it is where the meaning turns and deepens, where it gathers a kind of quiet sorrow and a kind of quiet grandeur at once. It did not work, and yet it did. It did not work in the way the king intended. His body was not preserved. It was stolen and lost, dissolved into the dark of the ages, until not even a certain trace of it remains. His treasures were plundered. His sealed statue had even its crystal eyes gouged out by robbers. The offering stopped. The priests departed. The cult fell silent. The courtyards filled with sand. By every measure the king himself would have used, the great machine for eternity failed. The robbers won, as they always won. The body did not endure. And yet, and here is the turn, in another sense, the king achieved exactly what he set out to achieve. He wanted to be remembered forever, to escape the oblivion that swallows the dead to live on. And he has 4,500 years after his death. We are speaking his name. His face in stone survives, gazing north. His monument still rises from the desert, the oldest of its kind, visited and studied and marveled at by people from every corner of the earth. He is one of the most enduringly remembered human beings who has ever lived. The body was lost, but the name endured. The eternity of the flesh failed, but the eternity of memory succeeded beyond anything he could have dreamed. He sought to live forever among the stars, and instead he lives forever in the human imagination, which may in the end be the only kind of immortality that any of us can truly reach. This is not science fiction. This is not a story someone invented to comfort us. This is the plain fact of a real man who really lived, who really died, whose real monument still stands in the real desert west of an ancient city, and whose name we really do still speak 4,500 years on. The first pyramid is not a legend. It is stone you could touch. The watching statue is not a myth. It is a real face, carved by real hands, that you can stand before today. And the king's strange, doomed, magnificent bid for eternity is not a fable. It happened. A human being did this, and across an almost unimaginable gulf of time, the thing he built to defeat death is still here, and so, in the only way that finally proved possible, is he. Let us sit with what that says about us, about all human beings, in every age. For Djoser's hope is not strange to us. It is the most familiar thing in the world. Every one of us, in some quiet chamber of the heart, hopes that death is not the end, hopes to be remembered, hopes that something of us will last. We build our own monuments, smaller ones, the children we raise, the work we make, the marks we leave on the people we love, the words we write, the things we build that we hope will outlast us. The impulse that raised the first pyramid is the same impulse that makes a person plant a tree they will not live to sit beneath, or carve their initials into a stone, or hope to be spoken of kindly after they are gone. Djoser simply had a kingdom at his command, and so his version of that universal hope took the form of the largest building the world had yet seen. But the hope itself is one we all share. When we stand before his pyramid, we are not looking at something alien. We are looking at our own deepest wish, written larger than anyone has ever written it before or since, the wish not to vanish, the wish to endure, the wish that love and memory might reach across the dark. And there is a gentleness in how his story finally answers that wish. For the king did not get the eternity, he got a different one. One he could not have foreseen, not the preserved body in the granite vault, but the remembered name in the mouths of strangers, 4,500 years away, in languages he never knew, in lands he never imagined. It is as though the universe granted his wish, but not in his own terms, gave him immortality, but of the kind that comes through memory and wonder rather than through preserved flesh. And perhaps there is a quiet comfort in that for all of us. We cannot keep our bodies. We cannot, any of us, defeat death in the way Djoser tried to, but we can be remembered. We can leave something behind that lasts. We can plant the tree, and carve the name, and do the work, and love the people, and hope that some echo of us reaches forward into a time we will not see. Djoser did, and here we are, in that time he never saw. Speaking of him still, let that sink in. As the night settles around you, that the oldest pyramid is, at its heart, a message from one human being across the deepest gulf of time, saying simply, I was here. Remember me, and we do. There is one more thread to draw out, and it reaches up out of the desert into the night sky above us all. Think of the imperishable stars, the ones the king's statue was set to watch, the ones his people believed he rose to join, the stars near the northern pole of the sky that wheel and circle but never set. Those same stars are still there tonight. The very stars that Djoser's people watched, that they carved into the plan of his burial ceiling, that the crystal eyes of his statue were aimed toward across the centuries. Those same stars are shining over you wherever you are right now. The sky has turned a little across 4,500 years, but the imperishable stars still turn about the northern pole, still never setting, still shining every night, just as they did when the first pyramid was new. There is something that closes a great circle in that thought. The king hoped to rise and join the stars that never die. We do not know what became of whatever the Egyptians believed survived him, but the stars he set his hopes upon are still there, still turning, still imperishable. And when you look up at them, you are looking at the very thing a king 4,500 years ago believed he would become. The watching statue still faces them. The stars still shine, and the long gaze between them has never once been broken. And consider, too, what it means to build something larger than yourself, something you will not live to see completed, something made for a time beyond your own. Djoser did not build the first pyramid for the people of his own day. Not really. He built it for his eternity, for a time when he would be gone. He spent the years of his reign raising a thing whose true purpose lay entirely on the far side of his own death. There is a kind of faith in that which is worth honoring. Whatever we make of the beliefs behind it, the faith to labor for a future you will not witness, to build for a time you will not inhabit, to plant, as the saying goes, trees whose shade you will never sit in. Every cathedral raised across generations, every long work passed from hand to hand, every parent's labor for a child's distant future shares something with the first pyramid, the willingness to pour one's effort across the boundary of one's own life into a time one will never see. Djoser did it on the grandest scale anyone ever has, and in doing so, he reached us. For here we are, in the unimaginable future he built toward, receiving the message of his stones. The future he could not see has arrived, and it is us. And we are still listening, and perhaps that is the gentlest lesson the first pyramid has to offer as you lie here in the dark. Not that we should fear death, and not that we should deny it, but that we might face it as Djoser faced it, not with terror, but with hope, and with the quiet work of leaving something behind. The king did not know whether his eternity would come. He could not know. No one can. But he built toward it anyway, with all the care and beauty and patience he could command, and he trusted the rest to time and to the stars. There is a kind of peace in that posture when you sit with it. The peace of having done what one can and of laying the rest down. We do what we can. We build what we can build. We love whom we can love. And then, like the king, we lie down in the dark and trust the rest to whatever comes. The first pyramid, for all its grandeur, finally teaches something very simple and very calming, that a life can reach beyond itself, that an ending need not be only an ending, and that it is possible to lie down at the last in something like hope. So that is the deeper meaning, as far as one night can reach toward it. A man's refusal to accept death, written in the first mountain of stone, a bid for eternity that failed in the flesh and succeeded in memory, a universal human hope written larger than ever before or since, and a quiet answer across 4,500 years to the oldest wish in the human heart. Let us carry that gently with us now into the last part of our night, as we lay the story and the king and ourselves down toward sleep. And so our night draws gently to its close, and it is time to let the story and the king and yourself settle slowly down toward sleep. There is nothing more to learn now, nothing more to follow, no need to hold on to any name or any fact. Let it all soften and blur, the way the edges of the desert blur in the last light of evening. We will simply rest now, here at the end, in the quiet company of a king who lay down to sleep 4,500 years ago, and in the long calm of the monument he left behind. Let us return, one last time in the eye of the mind, to the plateau of Saqqara, in the cool and the silence of the night. The day's heat has left the desert. The sky is enormous and black and scattered with stars, and there, rising from the pale sand, stands the first pyramid, the great stepped mountain of stone, its 6 tiers climbing toward the heavens, dark against the starlight. It has stood here for 4,500 years. It stood through all the later dynasties of Egypt, through the coming of the Greeks and the Romans, through the long centuries of silence, through everything. Down to this very night, and it stands here still, patient and enormous and calm, as the stars wheel slowly overhead. Walk with me softly, around to the north side where the sealed stone box leans against the pyramid. Kneel down, the way you did at the very beginning of our night, and look through the 2 small holes. There, in the dark, sits the statue of the king, as it has sat for 46 centuries, wrapped in its cloak, its face grave and still, its hollow eyes gazing out, past you, past everything. Toward the northern sky, follow that gaze upward now. Out of the dark box, up the face of the pyramid, up past the highest step into the great black sky above. There, in the north, the imperishable stars are turning. The stars that never set, the stars the king hoped to join. Wheeling slowly about their fixed point, shining as they have shone every night for all the ages of the world. The statue watches them still. It has watched them all night, every night. For 4,500 years, and it will go on watching them long after this night is over, long after all of us are gone. Gazing north at the stars that never die, think of how much time has passed, and how little those stars have changed. The king was laid in his granite vault, and the stars turned. The robbers came and took his body, and the stars turned. The offering ceased and the priests departed, and the stars turned. The sand drifted into the courtyards, and the centuries piled up like the sand, and empires rose and fell across the world, and still every night the imperishable stars turned slowly about the northern pole. Exactly as they turn tonight, exactly as the king's statue watches them turn, there is a deep peace in that thought, a peace as wide as the desert and as old as the sky. Everything passes, everything is taken. In time, the body, the treasure, the offerings, the cult, the very memory of how the king died. All gone, all dissolved into the long dark, and yet the stars remain, and the stone remains, and the patient watching face remains, and the great calm of the desert night remains, holding it all, as it has always held it. Let your breathing slow now, as slow and easy as the turning of those stars. There is nothing you need to do. There is nowhere you need to be. The story is told, the king is at rest. The pyramid stands, the stars turn, and the night is deep and soft and kind. Let the weight of the day sink down through you and away, the way the day's heat sinks away from the desert sand after dark. Let your thoughts grow quiet and slow, drifting like the sand, settling like the dust in the long-sealed chambers. Coming gently to rest, there is no hurry now. There is only the rest at the end of the story, the long calm at the end of the day. Let the great wall of the complex rise around you in your mind, pale and tall and quiet in the starlight, enclosing a space of perfect stillness. Inside it the courtyards lie empty and silent. The courtyards where the king was to run his jubilee forever, empty now, but calm, bathed in the soft light of the stars, the pale stone glowing faintly in the dark. The dummy shrines stand in their rows, patient and silent. The false doors wait in the walls, doorways that open only for the spirit, and over it all, the great stepped mountain rises, step upon step toward the turning sky. Nothing moves, nothing stirs. There is only the vast and ancient quiet of the desert night, settling over the first pyramid as it has settled over it for 4,500 years. And you are there, in that quiet, held by it, growing slower and softer and more at peace with every breath. Let yourself sink, gently, the way the king was lowered into his vault, down through the layers of the night toward sleep, down past the cares of the day, which loosen and fall away, down past the noise and the hurry of the waking world, which grows faint and far, down into the deep still, quiet place where rest is waiting for you. As the granite vault waited at the bottom of the shaft, deep and silent and sealed away from all disturbance. There is nothing that can reach you there. There is nothing you need to carry down with you. Let it all stay above, in the light, and let yourself descend, slow and easy and unafraid, into the soft dark of sleep. The way the king descended, trusting, into his eternity. Feel how slow your breathing has become. Slow as the turning of the imperishable stars, slow as the drift of sand across the silent courtyards, slow as the long patient years that have passed over the first pyramid. Each breath in soft and unhurried. Each breath out, letting a little more of the day fall away. There is nothing to reach for, nothing to finish, nothing to fear. The watching statue keeps its calm vigil in the dark, and you may set your own watch down now and rest. The great stone mountain holds its place under the stars, needing nothing, waiting for nothing, simply enduring in the quiet. And you may let yourself be that still, that calm, that at ease, sinking softly into the night, with nothing left to do and nowhere left to go but gently down into sleep. And as you sink, let the images of our night drift past you, softly, one by one, asking nothing of you like things half, seen in the moment before dreaming. The river, dark and wide and slow, carrying its boats toward the west. The pale plateau above the valley, scattered with the tombs of the ancestors. The great stepped mountain, rising into the evening light. The deep shaft, and the granite vault, and the labyrinth of tunnels reaching out into the rock. The shining chambers of blue tile, gleaming faintly in the dark. The watching statue with its grave still face, gazing north. And above it all, the imperishable stars turning slowly, brightly, endlessly in the great black sky. Let them drift past and let them go. Each one softening into the dark as sleep comes closer. You do not need to hold any of them. Let them turn, like the stars, and pass, like the river, and fade like the day. The king built all of this to carry himself into sleep. For that, in the end, is what death was to the Egyptians. Not an ending, but a sleep, from which they hoped to wake into a longer day. He lay down in the dark beneath the steps, trusting that he would rise among the stars. And whatever became of that hope, there is something deeply restful in the image of it. A king lying down, at the end of his long reign and his long labor, in the heart of the mountain he had built, beneath a ceiling painted with stars, trusting himself to the night. We can borrow a little of that trust now, as we lie here in our own dark. We can lay down the day and the week and all the cares we have been carrying. The way the king laid down his crown and his cares and his very body, and we can trust ourselves to the night and to sleep and to whatever gentle morning waits on the far side of it. The first pyramid is still standing out there in the dark, under the turning stars. The watching statue is still gazing north, patient and calm. The imperishable stars are still wheeling slowly overhead, just as they did for the king, just as they will long after us. And you are here, safe and warm and growing drowsy, held in the same vast and ancient night that holds the pyramid and the statue and the stars. There is nothing left to do but rest. Let the story carry you down, the way the dark river was thought to carry the dead king gently toward the dawn. Let your eyes close if they have not already. Let the desert grow quiet. Let the stars turn. Let the great stepped mountain keep its long watch as it always has, while you let go and drift and sink softly down into rest. There is nothing to hold on to now, and nothing to fear. Only the slow bright turning of the stars over the sleeping king and the sleeping world, and over you, here, safe and warm in the dark, drifting at last into your own quiet sleep. The king is at peace beneath his mountain of stone. The stars are turning slow and bright and imperishable. In the northern sky, and it is time, now, for you to rest as well. Breathe slowly, let go. The night will hold you as it has held the first pyramid for 4,500 years, gently, and without end. Rest now, slowly and deeply. There is all the time in the world, and none of it is needed for anything at all, but sleep, sleep well.